My name's James Rumney. I'm an optometrist in the UK, and I've been an enthusiastic advocate for the use of OCT in primary care practice ever since we put our first instrument in 2007. I'm currently president of the European Academy of Optometry and Optics, and it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you on this subject. I should note and make a financial declaration that I'm an employed clinical advisor to Topcon UK Limited. So let's take ourselves back to Easter week in 1900, and when we look into that picture, we can ask the question, where is the car? And there it is, the single car in a street full of horse-drawn transport. 13 years later, we can ask the same question, where is the horse? And this is an example of disruptive technology that has taken place just over 100 years ago. Disruptive technology is when a convergence of technologies and circumstances make it possible for companies and individuals to create a new market. And so this can change, weaken, transform or destroy an existing product or market. And OCT is one of those such subjects. If you look to the picture up on the top right there, that's a photograph of downtown Rochester, New York. And it's one of those things that is true to say that digital cameras have pretty much destroyed film cameras. In 1976, as a tourist, I went round Kodak in Rochester, where they stored more silver than Fort Knox. But in January 2012, Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Uber is another example where it's not destroying, but it's radically transforming the taxi industry. And of course, it's not necessarily the smartest people in the room who predict or even get the disruptions, but they're sure going to tell you they knew it was going to happen. So we look at what experts have forecast. In 1985, Back to the Future, AT&T hired McKinsey. They asked them to forecast cell phone adoption by 2000, in other words, in 15 years, and they said they probably thought there was a market for 900,000 in the USA. And in actual fact, 109 million mobile phones were in use in the USA by the year 2000. That's not a small mistake, that's 120 times wrong. And of course, they charge more money than the number of subscribers. Other misjudgments were, for example, AT&T landline industry disrupted completely. They missed out on trillions of dollars. There was a gentleman called Dick Rowe, the A&R at Decca Records, who said that guitar groups are on the way out. The Beatles have no future in show business. Somebody called Ken Olsen said there was no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. If I'd have asked the public for advice, they'd have said they wanted faster horses, said Henry Ford. And the internet will catastrophically collapse in 1996, predicted by Robert Metcalfe just 1 year earlier. So the classic disruptive model is sometimes a business model. Start with something cheaper, then it becomes better. Uber is cheaper, better, faster and more customizable, and sometimes it's more expensive but better. So here's a typical example of technology. Most of us will remember the Nokia phone, supplanted by the iPhone. The iPhone was introduced at the time when the mainstream Nokia was $100, but a $700 product by Apple iPhone was more expensive but a superior product, and it took over. So here we have a technology cost curve coming down, so it disrupts the cost curve from above, not from below. On the same cost basis, semiconductor performance tends to improve on a double or triple basis each year, called Moore's law. And in 1 decade, that's 1,000 times improvement, 2 decades, 1,000,000 times improvement, etc. OCT is such a form of disruptive technology. It's non-invasive, it's line of sight, it's layer by layer detection, it's depth measuring, it's analogous to ultrasound, it's qualitative and quantitative, and the OCT quantitative measurement depends on assumptions such as the refractive index, but at the end of the day, it's an extremely useful tool. OCT tomography is an example of a form of tomography, and here we can see tomography produced through PET or ultrasound up on the top right, where the penetration of tissues is deeper but the resolution is lower, and as we move down to the bottom right we're looking at typical ultrasound. and then we're looking towards the ultrasound scan of the anterior segment, and finally to the macula on a current OCT, with each presenting an order of magnitude in smaller dimensions. It basically is a cross-section to image internal structures. So why would we use light? Well, we can see more details, it enables higher resolution than sound, and it's non-invasive, and it allows us into the posterior segment. It's an optical analog of ultrasound. So if we take that small segment and look at it with ultrasound, at 20 megahertz ultrasound, it's a fairly low resolution image. We look at that with an early OCT image and it's significantly better, until we look at swept source, where we can actually see there the contact lens on the eye, we can see the ciliary body, we can see the iris. That's significant improvement. You can even see the canal of Schlemm on that particular image.
Un comprobado líder en la práctica de lentes especiales y ojo seco. Cuando la precisión importa.
So what's been used for anterior segment OCT? Well, the Zeiss Visante, now largely obsolete, was one of the first major instruments used in this regard. It produced a full 16mm wide scan that was deep enough to bridge the entire anterior chamber. And here we can see an example of a relatively deep anterior chamber with a quite closed anterior chamber angle. It basically ensures visibility into the areas of the angle, but the resolution was quite low. It gives you an opportunity to measure the anterior lens vault and was thought to be useful in the fitting of phakic contact lenses. Now, resolution has moved on with the advent of swept source, and this gives you an indication of both the imaging speed increasing up on the y-axis against time. And the Visante is seen there relative to 2007, but relatively low scan speeds up to current scan speeds of 100,000 scans per second or higher. So I've used Triton quite extensively. The Triton swept source, it does enable you to achieve an anterior segment scan using a little device that increases the space between the forehead and the instrument, and using a little telecentric lens to produce the actual focused image. The telecentric lens slots onto the front and enables you to get access to the anterior segment. It produces a series of A scans on a vertical basis and then assembles the picture. But first, let's have a look at comparing spectral domain OCT and swept source OCT. First of all, you can see that the wavelength is different, 840 nanometers compared to 1050. The scan speed is nearly double with swept source, and the acquisition time is halved. So this is a particularly important development, particularly when it comes to anterior segment, as you will see. Swept source OCT has a tunable laser where the wavelength is changing. It runs an image through the photodetector, reflecting back at the retina and back into the photodetector. Swept source OCT, by using a longer wavelength, enables you to get access to deeper layers, particularly into the RPE in the choroid. 840 nanometer infrared is scattered more by the tissue and absorbed by melanin. The 1050 passes straight through that. There have been various attempts at producing 16mm full chamber angle swept source imaging, but most of them are actually Photoshop pictures, simply because the depth is not possible. Most OCT scans can only manage a depth of around about 2 millimeters or so, and obviously to get a full scan into the depth of the crystalline lens, you need significantly deeper scanning. So that's actually two images one of each angle and one of the central cone of the cornea assembled together in Photoshop. So apart from the Zeiss Visanti, most anterior segment imaging uses a stitched image. Few have that depth. A new development on the block is the Anterion by Heidelberg. It's a multimodal imaging platform optimized for anterior segment use, for angle assessment, pachymetry, corneal thickness, etc. It produces a series of scans, and there are a series of modules where it can be used, for example, assessing the cornea, helpful in fitting contact lenses, and in assessing change over time with this typical butterfly astigmatic correction, looking at difference maps. It can be used in cataract for assessing biometry, and here we can see the calculations of the anterior chamber depth, calculations associated with creating intraocular lens accuracy. There's a metrics app which enables you to make detailed measurements in multiple views, which can be put together to create a three-dimensional diagram. It can be used in anterior chamber angle assessment as a deep angle visible there, and in the imaging app for anterior segment imaging. And this showing a intax in position and then looking deeper into the anterior chamber structure. So what can we do with anterior segment OCT? We can certainly look at the anterior chamber angle, and here is a swept source image. It shows the ciliary body, it shows the canal of Schlemm, it shows the iris, and we should be aware of this artifact here, which arises as a result of the limited ability for depth from top to bottom of the image. We can use it to assess vaulting, and I'm indebted to my colleague Brian Tompkins for showing me this picture of a scleral lens. Here we can see the cornea in the top in the yellow square, and underneath that is the vaulting fluid of the tear film, and underneath that is the cornea. And obviously the image immediately beneath is showing some area of contact with the cornea, and it's not quite aligned. We could use it even for measuring the size and positioning of the tear film, which I suppose could be used in assessment of a dry eye. It can be used for quantification, so here we're using the cursors to measure in microns the thickness of the contact lens, the thickness of the vault, and the thickness of the cornea in a typical keratoconic fitting where the cornea is thinner than average at 442 microns. You can assess the landing zone of the contact lens, so the image on the right hand side shows the area where the OCT scan is under the green arrow, and the image on the left hand side, the B scan, shows where that contact lens is actually sitting and partially indenting the conjunctiva. Synergize manufacture a high volt ultra health lens, which is a hybrid lens of part soft, part RGP. And here we can see the typical image of a toric contact lens using the inferior ballasting system, so that the thickness of the lens is higher at the bottom of the lens. That's on a vertical axis of an OCT scan. In looking at this peripheral retina, we're looking at the anterior chamber angle, but also where there has been a filtration bleb and there appears to be some separation of the retinal tissues immediately behind the ciliary body in the areas of the pars plana. High resolution can allow better visualization of a LASIK flap. So this is 2 years after LASIK, showing the mechanical microkeratome, showing the actual interface zone. And that might also show, although this is actually quite a poor resolution image, we can see the epithelial ingrowths, the fluid and the fibrosis associated with post-LASIK complications. It's been advocated to use OCT in contact lens design and research, looking at different fitting patterns, and notice how the red coloration increases with the steepness of fit depending on the degree of indentation. It's been used in research for lens movement, and here we can see the OCT scan demonstrating movement over time over the number of frames and the relative shift of the 8.4 to the 8.6 night and day lens. Perhaps that's not necessarily a particularly practical use, because of course most practitioners, most eye care practitioners would be able to tell that one lens was fitting and moving more or less than another. So it's also been advocated to establish a set of guidance for ocular topography measurements so that we can achieve a controlled specification of lenses. So that would record the surgical profile straddling the corneo-scleral junction, and then measure, for example, the CD, which is the corneal diameter, the increase in horizontal iris diameter, the corneal sag with a wide variation between 2.6 3.7 millimeters, CS15, which would be the sag at the 15 millimeter chord, etc., etc. And these have been advocated using OCT as the underlying measure. Edge profile has also been analysed, and here we can see a lens that does appear to be indenting the conjunctiva. We've even got a little bit of blanching, I think, on the photograph to the right hand side. In practice, I can point you towards Greg Gamouls in Texas, who has used OCT in corneoscleral fitting for post-graft keratoconus and other ectasias. So he might take a horizontal scan, a vertical scan, look at the point spread function, analyze the design, and create a lens that optimizes apical clearance and optimizes fit and optics at the same time, thus improving the visual optics of the final outcome. Synergize Ultra Health can be used in the case of someone who has had a graft, or in this particular case it's a radial K, and you can see the vaulting of the RGP component of the Ultra Health hybrid lens. It's a 72-year-old female who had radial K in New Zealand in 1998. She's now hypermetropic but with significant astigmatism and is plagued by glare at night. Her best VA in spectacles is 615, but the Ultra Health lens takes it to 6.6 in each eye, and she achieves 10 hours and has a 120 micron vault. This is an example of a scleral fitting being shown by Brian Tompkins. Again, quite deep vaulting over what is quite an irregular shaped cornea. So what is the future? This is a prototype 3D OCT visualization of a multifocal contact lens, a multifocal intraocular lens I should say, created by Carl Glittenberg. And it just gives an illustration of what we may be looking forward to in the future. Anterior OCT is certainly an area of development, and although we're not at the end of that development yet, you can see how disruptive it is for all of those of us involved in contact lens fitting. So that's the future in a world of disruptive technology. Thank you for listening.